Yes, replied Dick Sand, and now it prevents the interior air from being renewed. Could we not make a hole in the wall above the level of the water? Asked the old black. Doubtless, Tom, but if we have 5 feet of water within, there are perhaps 6 or 7, even more without. You think, Mr. Dick? I think, Tom, that the water, rising inside the anthill, has compressed the air in the upper part, and that this air now makes an obstacle to prevent the water from rising higher. But if we pierce a hole in the wall by which the air would escape, either the water would still rise till it reached the outside level, or if it passed the hole, it would rise to that point where the compressed air would again keep it back. We must be here like workmen in a diving bell. What must be done? Asked Tom. Reflect well before acting, replied Dick Sand. An imprudence might cost us our lives. The young novice's observation was very true. In comparing the cone to a submerged bell, he was right. Only in that apparatus the air is constantly renewed by means of pumps. The divers breathe comfortably, and they suffer no other inconveniences than those resulting from a prolonged sojourn in a compressed atmosphere, no longer at a normal pressure. But here, beside those inconveniences, space was already reduced a third by the invasion of the water. As to the air, it would only be renewed if they put it in communication with the outer atmosphere by means of a hole. Could they, without running the danger spoken of by Dick Sand, pierce that hole? Would not the situation be aggravated by it? What was certain was that the water now rested at a level which only two causes could make it exceed, namely, if they pierced a hole and the level of the rising waters was higher outside, or if the height of this rising water should still increase. In either of these cases, only a narrow space would remain inside the cone, where the air, not renewed, would be still more compressed. But might not the anthill be torn from the ground and overthrown by the inundation, to the extreme danger of those within it? No, no more than a beaver's hut, so firmly did it adhere by its base. Then, the event most to be feared was the persistence of the storm, and, consequently, the increase of the inundation. 30 feet of water on the plain would cover the cone with 18 feet of water and bear on the air within with the pressure of an atmosphere. Now, after reflecting well upon it, Dick Sand was led to fear that this inundation might increase considerably. In fact, it could not be due solely to that deluge poured out by the clouds. It seemed more probable that a neighboring watercourse, swelled by the storm, had burst its banks, and was spreading over this plain lying below it. What proof had they that the anthill was not then entirely submerged, and that it was full time to leave it by the top part, which would not be difficult to demolish? Dick Sand, now extremely anxious, asked himself what he ought to do. Must he wait or suddenly announce the probable result of the situation, after ascertaining the condition of things? It was then 3 o'clock in the morning. All, motionless, silent, listened. The noise from outside came very feebly through the obstructed orifice. All the time a dull sound, strong and continued, well indicated that the contest of the elements had not ceased. At that moment, old Tom observed that the water level was gradually rising. Yes, replied Dick Sand, and if it rises, as the air cannot escape from within, it is because the rising of the waters increases and presses it more and more. It is but slight so far, said Tom. Without doubt, replied Dick Sand, but where will this level stop? Mr. Dick, asked Bat, would you like me to go out of the anthill? By diving, I should try to slip out by the hole. It will be better for me to try it, replied Dick Sand. No, Mr. Dick, no, replied old Tom quickly. Let my son do it and trust to his skill. In case he could not return, your presence is necessary here. Then lower. Do not forget Mrs. Weldon and little Jack. Be it so, replied Dick Sand. Go then, Bat, if the anthill is submerged, do not seek to enter it again. We shall try to come out as you will have done. But if the cone still emerges, strike on its top with the axe that you will take with you. We will hear you, and it will be the signal for us to demolish the top from our side. You understand? Yes, Mr. Dick, replied Bat. Go then, boy, added old Tom, pressing his son's hand. Bat, after laying in a good provision of air by a long aspiration, plunged under the liquid mass, whose depth then exceeded 5 feet. It was a rather difficult task, because he would have to seek the lower orifice, slip through it, and then rise to the outside surface of the waters. That must be done quickly. Nearly half a minute passed away. Dick Sand then thought that Bat had succeeded in passing outside when the black emerged. "Well," exclaimed Dick Sand. "The hole is stopped up by rubbish," replied Bat as soon as he could take breath. "Stopped up," repeated Tom. "Yes," replied Bat. "The water has probably diluted the clay. I have felt around the walls with my hand. There is no longer any hole." Dick Sand shook his head. His companions and he were hermetically sequestered in this cone, perhaps submerged by the water. "If there is no longer any hole," then said Hercules, "we must make one." "Wait," replied the young novice, stopping Hercules, who, hatchet in hand, was preparing to dive. Dick Sand reflected for a few moments, and then he said, "We are going to proceed in another manner. The whole question is to know whether the water covers the anthill or not. If we make a small opening at the summit of the cone, we shall find out which it is. But in case the anthill should be submerged now, the water would fill it entirely, and we would be lost. Let us feel our way." "But quickly," replied Tom. In fact, the level continued to rise gradually. There were then 6 feet of water inside the cone. With the exception of Mrs. Weldon, her son, cousin Benedict, and Nan, who had taken refuge in the upper cavities, all were immersed to the waist. Then there was a necessity for quick action, as Dick Sand proposed. It was 1 foot above the interior level, consequently 7 feet from the ground, that Dick Sand resolved to pierce a hole in the clay wall. If by this hole they were in communication with the outer air, the cone emerges. If, on the contrary, this hole was pierced below the water level outside, the air would be driven inward, and in that case they must stop it up at once, or the water would rise to its orifice. Then they would commence again a foot higher, and so on. If, at last, at the top, they did not yet find the outer air, it was because there was a depth of more than 15 feet of water in the plain, and that the whole termite village had disappeared under the inundation. Then what chance had the prisoners in the anthill to escape the most terrible of deaths, death by slow asphyxia? Dick Sand knew all that, but he did not lose his presence of mind for a moment. He had closely calculated the consequences of the experiment he wished to try. Besides, to wait longer was not possible. Asphyxia was threatening in this narrow space, reduced every moment, in a medium already saturated with carbonic acid. The best tool Dick Sand could employ to pierce a hole through the wall was a ramrod furnished with a screw, intended to draw the wadding from a gun. By making it turn rapidly, this screw scooped out the clay like an auger, and the hole was made little by little. Then it would not have a larger diameter than that of the ramrod, but that would be sufficient. The air could come through very well. Hercules, holding up the lantern, lighted Dick Sand. They had some wax candles to take its place, and they had not to fear lack of light from that source. A minute after the beginning of the operation, the ramrod went freely through the wall. At once a rather dull noise was produced, resembling that made by globules of air escaping through a column of water. The air escaped, and at the same moment the level of the water rose in the cone and stopped at the height of the hole. This proved that they had pierced too low, that is to say, below the liquid mass. "Begin again," the young novice said, coolly, after rapidly stopping the hole with a handful of clay. The water was again stationary in the cone, but the reserved space had diminished more than 8 inches. Respiration became difficult, for the oxygen was beginning to fail. They saw it also by the lantern's light, which reddened and lost a part of its brightness. 1 foot above the first hole, Dick Sand began at once to pierce a second by the same process. If the experiment failed, the water would rise still higher inside the cone, but that risk must be run. While Dick Sand was working his auger, they heard Cousin Benedict cry out suddenly, "Mercy, look, 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 why!" Hercules raised his lantern and threw its light on Cousin Benedict, whose face expressed the most perfect satisfaction. "Yes," repeated he, "look why those intelligent termites have abandoned the anthill. They had felt the inundation beforehand. Ah, instinct, my friends, instinct. The termites are wiser than we are, much wiser." And that was all the moral Cousin Benedict drew from the situation. At that moment, Dick Sand drew out the ramrod, which had penetrated the wall. A hissing was produced. The water rose another foot inside the cone. The hole had not reached the open air outside. The situation was dreadful. Mrs. Weldon, then almost reached by the water, had raised little Jack in her arms. All were stifling in this narrow space. Their ears buzzed. The lantern only threw a faint light. "Is the cone, then, entirely underwater?" murmured Dick Sand. He must know, and in order to know, he must pierce a third hole at the very top. But it was asphyxia, it was immediate death, if the result of this last attempt should prove fruitless. The air remaining inside would escape through the upper sheet of water, and the water would fill the whole cone. "Mrs. Weldon," then said Dick Sand, "you know the situation. If we delay, respirable air will fail us. If the third attempt fails, water will fill all this space. Our only chance is that the summit of the cone is above the level of the inundation. We must try this last experiment. Are you willing?" "Do it, Dick," replied Mrs. Weldon. At that moment, the lantern went out in that medium, already unfit for combustion. Mrs. Weldon and her companions were plunged in the most complete darkness. Dick Sand was perched on Hercules's shoulders. The latter was hanging on to one of the lateral cavities. Only his head was above the bed of water. Mrs. Weldon, Jack, and Cousin Benedict were in the last story of cells. Dick Sand scratched the wall, and his ramrod pierced the clay rapidly. In this place, the wall, being thicker and harder also, was more difficult to penetrate. Dick Sand hastened, not without terrible anxiety, for by this narrow opening either life was going to penetrate with the air, or with the water it was death. Suddenly a sharp hissing was heard. The compressed air escaped, but a ray of daylight filtered through the wall. The water only rose 8 inches and stopped, without Dick Sand being obliged to close the hole. The equilibrium was established between the level within and that outside. The summit of the cone emerged. Mrs. Weldon and her companions were saved. At once, after a frantic hurrah, in which Hercules's thundering voice prevailed, the cutlasses were put to work. The summit, quickly attacked, gradually crumbled. The hole was enlarged, the pure air entered in waves, and with it the first rays of the rising sun. The top once taken off the cone, it would be easy to hoist themselves on to its wall, and they would devise means of reaching some neighboring height, above all inundations. Dick Sand first mounted to the summit of the cone. A cry escaped him. That particular noise, too well known by African travelers, the whizzing of arrows, passed through the air. Dick Sand had had time to perceive a camp 100 feet from the anthill and 10 feet from the cone. On the inundated plain, long boats filled with natives. It was from one of those boats that the flight of arrows had come the moment the young novice's head appeared out of the hole. Dick Sand, in a word, had told all to his companions. Seizing his gun, followed by Hercules, Actaeon, and Bat, he reappeared at the summit of the cone, and all fired on one of the boats. Several natives fell, and yells, accompanied by shots, replied to the detonation of the firearms. But what could Dick Sand and his companions do against 100 Africans who surrounded them on all sides? The anthill was assailed. Mrs. Weldon, her child, and Cousin Benedict, all were brutally snatched from it, and without having had time to speak to each other or to shake hands for the last time, they saw themselves separated from each other, doubtless in virtue of orders previously given. A last boat took away Mrs. Weldon, little Jack, and Cousin Benedict. Dick Sand saw them disappear in the middle of the camp. As to him, accompanied by Nan, Old Tom, Hercules, Bat, Actaeon, and Austin, he was thrown into a second boat, which went toward another point of the hill. 20 natives entered this boat. It was followed by 5 others. Resistance was not possible, and nevertheless, Dick Sand and his companions attempted it. Some soldiers of the caravan were wounded by them, and certainly they would have paid for this resistance with their lives if there had not been a formal order to spare them. In a few minutes the passage was made, but just as the boat landed, Hercules, with an irresistible bound, sprang on the ground. 2 natives having sprung on him, the giant turned his gun like a club, and the natives fell, with their skulls broken. A moment after, Hercules disappeared under the cover of the trees, in the midst of a shower of balls, as Dick Sand and his companions, having been put on land, were chained like slaves. Chapter 7. In camp on the banks of the Konza. The aspect of the country was entirely changed since the inundation. It had made a lake of the plain where the termite village stood. The cones of 20 anthills emerged and formed the only projecting points on this large basin. The Konza had overflowed during the night, with the waters of its tributaries swelled by the storm. This Conza, one of the rivers of Angola, flows into the Atlantic, 100 miles from the Cape where the Pilgrim was wrecked. It was this river that Lieutenant Cameron had to cross some years later, before reaching Benguela. The Conza is intended to become the vehicle for the interior transit of this portion of the Portuguese colony. Already steamers ascend its lower course, and before 10 years elapse, they will ply over its upper bed. Dick Sand had then acted wisely in seeking some navigable river toward the north. The rivulet he had followed had just been emptied into the Conza. Only for this sudden attack, of which he had had no intimation to put him on his guard, he would have found the Conza a mile farther on. His companions and he would have embarked on a raft, easily constructed, and they would have had a good chance to descend the stream to the Portuguese villages, where the steamers come into port. There, their safety would be secured. It would not be so. The camp, perceived by Dick Sand, was established on an elevation near the anthill, into which fate had thrown him, as in a trap. At the summit of that elevation rose an enormous sycamore fig tree, which would easily shelter 500 men under its immense branches. Those who have not seen those giant trees of Central Africa can form no idea of them. Their branches form a forest, and one could be lost in it. Farther on, great banyans, of the kind whose seeds do not change into fruits, completed the outline of this vast landscape. It was under the sycamore's shelter, hidden, as in a mysterious asylum, that a whole caravan, the one whose arrival Harris had announced to Negoro, had just halted. This numerous procession of natives, snatched from their villages by the trader Alvaz's agents, were going to the Kazon market. Thence the slaves, as needed, would be sent either to the barracks of the west coast or to Enyangwe, toward the Great Lake region, to be distributed either in Upper Egypt or in the factories of Zanzibar. As soon as they arrived at the camp, Dick Sand and his companions had been treated as slaves. Old Tom, his son Austin, Actaeon, poor Nan, Negroes by birth, though they did not belong to the African race, were treated like captive natives. After they were disarmed, in spite of the strongest resistance, they were held by the throat, 2 by 2, by means of a pole 6 or 7 feet long, forked at each end and closed by an iron rod. By this means they were forced to march in line, one behind the other, unable to get away either to the right or to the left. As an over-precaution, a heavy chain was attached to their waists. They had their arms free to carry burdens, their feet free to march, but they could not use them to flee. Thus they were going to travel hundreds of miles under an overseer's lash. Placed apart, overcome by the reaction which followed the first moments of their struggle against the Negroes, they no longer made a movement. Why had they not been able to follow Hercules in his flight? And meanwhile, what could they hope for the fugitive? Strong as he was, what would become of him in that inhospitable country, where hunger, solitude, savage beasts, natives, all were against him? Would he not soon regret his companion's fate? They, however, had no pity to expect from the chiefs of the caravan, Arabs or Portuguese, speaking a language they could not understand. These chiefs only entered into communication with their prisoners by menacing looks and gestures. Dick Sand himself was not coupled with any other slave. He was a white man, and probably they had not dared to inflict the common treatment on him. Unarmed, he had his feet and hands free, but a driver watched him especially. He observed the camp, expecting each moment to see Negoro or Harris appear. His expectation was in vain. He had no doubt, however, that those two miserable men had directed the attack against the anthill. Thus the thought came to him that Mrs. Weldon, little Jack, and Cousin Benedict had been led away separately by orders from the American or from the Portuguese. Seeing neither one nor the other, he said to himself that perhaps the two accomplices even accompanied their victims. Where were they leading them? What would they do with them? It was his most cruel care. Dick Sand forgot his own situation to think only of Mrs. Weldon and hers. The caravan, camped under the gigantic sycamore, did not count less than 800 persons, say 500 slaves of both sexes, 200 soldiers, porters, marauders, guards, drivers, agents, or chiefs. These chiefs were of Arab and Portuguese origin. It would be difficult to imagine the cruelties that these inhuman beings inflicted on their captives. They struck them without relaxation, and those who fell exhausted, not fit to be sold, were finished with gunshots or the knife. Thus they hold them by terror. But the result of this system is that, on the arrival of the caravan, 50 out of 100 slaves are missing from the traders' list. A few may have escaped, but the bones of those who died from torture mark out the long routes from the interior to the coast. It is supposed that the agents of European origin, Portuguese for the most part, are only rascals whom their country has rejected, convicts, escaped prisoners, old slave drivers whom the authorities have been unable to hang. In a word, the refuse of humanity. Such was Negoro, such was Harris, now in the service of one of the greatest contractors of Central Africa, José Antonio Alves, well known by the traders of the province, about whom Lieutenant Cameron has given some curious information. The soldiers who escort the captives are generally natives in the pay of the traders, but the latter have not the monopoly of those raids which procure the slaves for them. The Negro kings also make atrocious wars with each other and with the same object. Then the vanquished adults, the women and children, reduced to slavery, are sold by the vanquishers for a few yards of calico, some powder, a few firearms, pink or red pearls, and often even, as Livingstone says, in periods of famine, for a few grains of maize. The soldiers who escorted old Alves's caravan might give a true idea of what African armies are. It was an assemblage of Negro bandits, hardly clothed, who brandished long flintlock guns, the gun barrels garnished with a great number of copper rings. With such an escort, to which are joined marauders who are no better, the agents often have all they can do. They dispute orders, they insist on their own halting places and hours, they threaten to desert, and it is not rare for the agents to be forced to yield to the exactions of the soldiery. Though the slaves, men or women, are generally subjected to carry burdens while the caravan is on the march, yet a certain number of porters accompany it. They are called more particularly pagazis, and they carry bundles of precious objects, principally ivory. Such is the size of these elephants' teeth sometimes, of which some weigh as much as 160 pounds, that it takes two of these pagazis to carry them to the factories. Thence this precious merchandise is exported to the markets of Khartoum, of Zanzibar and Natal. On arriving, these pagazis are paid the price agreed upon. It consists in 20 yards of cotton cloth, or of that stuff which bears the name of maracani, a little powder, a handful of curry, shells very common in that country, which serve as money, a few pearls, or even those of the slaves who would be difficult to sell. The slaves are paid when the trader has no other money. Among the 500 slaves that the caravan counted, there were few grown men. That is because, the razzia being finished and the village set on fire, every native above 40 is unmercifully massacred and hung to a neighboring tree. Only the young adults of both sexes and the children are intended to furnish the markets. After these men hunts, hardly a tenth of the vanquished survive. This explains the frightful depopulation, which changes vast territories of equatorial Africa into deserts. Here, the children and the adults were hardly clothed with a rag of that bark stuff, produced by certain trees, and called mbuzan in the country. Thus the state of this troop of human beings, women covered with wounds from the havildar's whips, children ghastly and meager, with bleeding feet, whom their mothers tried to carry in addition to their burdens, young men closely riveted to the fork, more torturing than the convict's chain, is the most lamentable that can be imagined. Yes, the sight of the miserable people, hardly living, whose voices have no sound, ebony skeletons according to Livingstone's expression, would touch the hearts of wild beasts. But so much misery did not touch those hardened Arabs nor those Portuguese, who, according to Lieutenant Cameron, are still more cruel. This is what Cameron says. To obtain these 50 women, of whom Alves called himself proprietor, 10 villages had been destroyed, 10 villages having each from 100 to 200 souls, a total of 1,500 inhabitants. Some had been able to escape, but the greater part, almost all, had perished in the flames, had been killed in defending their families, or had died of hunger in the jungle, unless the beasts of prey had terminated their sufferings more promptly. Those crimes, perpetrated in the center of Africa, by men who boast of the name of Christians, and consider themselves Portuguese, would seem incredible to the inhabitants of civilized countries. It is impossible that the government of Lisbon knows the atrocities committed by people who boast of being her subjects. Tour of the world. In Portugal, there have been very warm protestations against these assertions of Cameron's. It need not be said that, during the marches, as during the halts, the prisoners were very carefully guarded. Thus, Dick Sand soon understood that he must not even attempt to get away. But then, how find Mrs. Weldon again? That she and her child had been carried away by Negoro was only too certain. The Portuguese had separated her from her companions for reasons unknown as yet to the young novice. But he could not doubt Negoro's intervention, and his heart was breaking at the thought of the dangers of all kinds which threatened Mrs. Weldon. Ah, he said to himself, when I think that I have held those two miserable men, both of them at the end of my gun, and that I have not killed them. This thought was one of those which returned most persistently to Dick Sand's mind. What misfortunes the just death of Harris and Negoro might have prevented. What misery, at least, for those whom these brokers in human flesh were now treating as slaves. All the horror of Mrs. Weldon's and little Jack's situation now represented itself to Dick Sand. Neither the mother nor the child could count on Cousin Benedict. The poor man could hardly take care of himself. Doubtless they were taking all three to some district remote from the province of Angola. But who was carrying the still sick child? His mother, yes, his mother, Dick Sand repeated to himself. She will have recovered strength for him, she will have done what these unhappy female slaves do, and she will fall like them. Ah, may God put me again in front of her executioners, and I. But he was a prisoner. He counted one head in this livestock that the overseers were driving to the interior of Africa. He did not even know whether Negoro and Harris themselves were directing the convoy of which their victims made a part. Dingo was no longer there to scent the Portuguese, to announce his approach. Hercules alone might come to the assistance of the unfortunate Mrs. Weldon. But was that miracle to be hoped for? However, Dick Sand fell back again on that idea. He said to himself that the strong black man was free. Of his devotion there was no doubt. All that a human being could do, Hercules would do in Mrs. Weldon's interest. Yes, either Hercules would try to find them and put himself in communication with them, or if that failed him, he would endeavor to concert with him, Dick Sand, and perhaps carry him off, deliver him by force. During the night halts, mingling with these prisoners, black like them, could he not deceive the soldiers' vigilance, reach him, break his bonds, and lead him away into the forest? And both of them then free, what would they not do for Mrs. Weldon's safety? A water course would enable them to descend to the coast. Dick Sand would again take up that plan so unfortunately prevented by the natives' attack, with new chances of success and a greater knowledge of the difficulties. The young novice thus alternated between fear and hope. In fact, he resisted despair, thanks to his energetic nature, and held himself in readiness to profit by the least chance that might offer itself to him. What he most desired to know was to what market the agents were taking the convoy of slaves. Was it to one of the factories of Angola, and would it be an affair of a few halting places only, or would this convoy travel for hundreds of miles still, across Central Africa? The principal market of the contractors is that of Enyangwe, in Maniema, on that meridian which divides the African continent into two almost equal parts, there where extends the country of the Great Lakes, that Livingstone was then traversing. But it was far from the camp on the Konza to that village. Months of travel would not suffice to reach it. That was one of Dick Sand's most serious thoughts. For, once at Enyangwe, in case even Mrs. Weldon, Hercules, the other blacks, and he should succeed in escaping, how difficult it would be, not to say impossible, to return to the seacoast, in the midst of the dangers of such a long route. But Dick Sand soon had reason to think that the convoy would soon reach its destination. Though he did not understand the language employed by the chiefs of the caravan, sometimes Arab, sometimes the African idiom, he remarked that the name of an important market of that region was often pronounced. It was the name Kazond, and he knew that a very great trade in slaves was carried on there. He was then naturally led to believe that there the fate of the prisoners would be decided, whether for the profit of the king of that district or for the benefit of some rich trader of the country. We know that he was not mistaken. Now, Dick Sand, being posted in the facts of modern geography, knew very exactly what is known of Kazond. The distance from St. Paul de Londa to this city does not exceed 400 miles, and consequently 250 miles at the most, separates it from the camp established on the Konza. Dick Sand made his calculation approximately, taking the distance traveled by the little troop under Harris's lead as the base. Now, under ordinary circumstances, this journey would only require from 10 to 12 days. Doubling that time for the needs of a caravan already exhausted by a long route, Dick Sand might estimate the length of the journey from the Konza to Kazond at 3 weeks. Dick Sand wished very much to impart what he believed he knew to Tom and his companions. It would be a kind of consolation for them to be assured that they were not being led to the center of Africa, into those fatal countries which they could not hope to leave. Now, a few words uttered in passing would be sufficient to enlighten them. Would he succeed in saying those words? Tom and Bat, chance had reunited the father and son. Actaeon and Austin, forked 2 by 2, were at the right extremity of the camp. An overseer and a dozen soldiers watched them. Dick Sand, free in his movements, resolved to gradually diminish the distance that separated him from his companions to 50 steps. He then commenced to maneuver to that end. Very likely old Tom divined Dick Sand's thought. A word, pronounced in a low voice, warned his companions to be attentive. They did not stir, but they kept themselves ready to see, as well as to hear. Soon, with an indifferent air, Dick Sand had gained 50 steps more. From the place where he then was, he could have called out in such a manner as to be heard, that name Cazoned, and tell them what the probable length of the journey would be. But to complete his instructions and confer with them on their conduct during the journey would be still better. He then continued to draw nearer to them. Already his heart was beating with hope. He was only a few steps from the desired end, when the overseer, as if he had suddenly penetrated his intention, rushed on him. At the cries of that enraged person, 10 soldiers ran to the spot, and Dick Sand was brutally led back to the rear, while Tom and his companions were taken to the other extremity of the camp. Exasperated, Dick Sand had thrown himself upon the overseer. He had ended by breaking his gun in his hands. He had almost succeeded in snatching it from him, but 7 or 8 soldiers assailed him at once, and force was used to secure him. Furious, they would have massacred him, if one of the chiefs of the caravan, an Arab of great height and ferocious physiognomy, had not intervened. This Arab was the Chief Ibn Hamis of whom Harris had spoken. He pronounced a few words which Dick Sand could not understand, and the soldiers, obliged to release their prey, went away. It was then very evident, for one thing, that there had been a formal order not to allow the young novice to communicate with his companions, and for another, that his life should not be taken. Who could have given such orders, if not Harris or Negoro? At that moment it was 9 o'clock in the morning. Apith, the harsh sounds from a kondu's horn, a kind of ruminating animal among the African deer, burst forth, and the drum was heard. The halt was going to end. All chiefs, porters, soldiers, slaves were immediately on foot. Laden with their packs, several groups of captives were formed under the leadership of an overseer, who unfurled a banner of bright colors. The signal for departure was given. Songs then rose on the air, but they were the vanquished, not the vanquishers, who sang thus. This is what they said in these songs, a threatening expression of a simple faith from the slaves against their oppressors, against their executioners. You have sent me to the coast, but I shall be dead. I shall have a yoke no longer, and I shall return to kill you. Chapter 8. Some of Dick Sand's notes. Though the storm of the day before had ceased, the weather was still very unsettled. It was, besides, the period of the massacre, the second period of the rainy season, under this zone of the African heaven. The nights in particular would be rainy during 1, 2, or 3 weeks, which could only increase the misery of the caravan. It set out that day in cloudy weather, and, after quitting the banks of the Konza, made its way almost directly to the east. 50 soldiers marched at the head, 100 on each of the 2 sides of the convoy, the rest as a rear guard. It would be difficult for the prisoners to flee, even if they had not been chained. Women, children, and men were going pell-mell, and the overseers urged them on with the whip. There were unfortunate mothers who, nursing one child, held a second by the hand that was free. Others dragged these little beings along, without clothing, without shoes, on the sharp grasses of the soil. The chief of the caravan, that ferocious Ibn Hamis, who had interfered in the struggle between Dick Sand and his overseer, watched this whole troop, going backwards and forwards from the head to the foot of the long column. If his agents and he troubled themselves but little about the sufferings of their captives, they must reckon more seriously either with the soldiers who claimed some additional rations, or with the pagazis who wanted to halt. Thence discussions, often even an exchange of brutality. The slaves suffered more from the overseer's constant irritation. Nothing was heard but threats from one side and cries of grief from the other. Those who marched in the last ranks treaded a soil that the first had stained with their blood. Dick Sand's companions, always carefully kept in front of the convoy, could have no communication with him. They advanced in file, the neck held in the heavy fork, which did not permit a single head movement. The whips did not spare them any more than their sad companions in misfortune. Bat, coupled with his father, marched before him, taxing his ingenuity not to shake the fork, choosing the best places to step on, because old Tom must pass after him. From time to time, when the overseer was a little behind, he uttered various words of encouragement, some of which reached Tom. He even tried to retard his march if he felt that Tom was getting tired. It was suffering for this good son to be unable to turn his head towards his good father, whom he loved. Doubtless, Tom had the satisfaction of seeing his son. However, he paid dear for it. How many times great tears flowed from his eyes when the overseer's whip fell upon Bat? It was a worse punishment than if it had fallen on his own flesh. Austin and Actaeon marched a few steps behind, tied to each other, and brutally treated every moment. Ah, how they envied Hercules's fate. Whatever were the dangers that threatened the latter in that savage country, he could at least use his strength and defend his life. During the first moments of their captivity, Old Tom had finally made known the whole truth to his companions. They had learned from him, to their profound astonishment, that they were in Africa, that Negoro's and Harris's double treachery had first thrown them there, and then led them away, and that no pity was to be expected from their masters. Nan was not better treated. She made part of a group of women who occupied the middle of the convoy. They had chained her with a young mother of 2 children, one at the breast, the other aged 3 years, who walked with difficulty. Nan, moved with pity, had burdened herself with the little creature, and the poor slave had thanked her by a tear. Nan then carried the infant at the same time, sparing her the fatigue to which she would have yielded and the blows the overseer would have given her. But it was a heavy burden for old Nan. She felt that her strength would soon fail her, and then she thought of little Jack. She pictured him to herself in his mother's arms. Sickness had wasted him very much, but he must be still heavy for Mrs. Weldon's weakened arms. Where was she? What would become of her? Would her old servant ever see her again? Dick Sand had been placed almost in the rear of the convoy. He could neither perceive Tom, nor his companions, nor Nan. The head of the long caravan was only visible to him when it was crossing some plain. He walked, a prey to the saddest thoughts, from which the agent's cries hardly drew his attention. He neither thought of himself, nor the fatigues he must still support, nor of the tortures probably reserved for him by Negoro. He only thought of Mrs. Weldon. In rain he sought on the ground, on the brambles by the paths, on the lower branches of the trees, to find some trace of her passage. She could not have taken another road, if, as everything indicated, they were leading her to Kazond. What would he not give to find some indication of her march to the destination where they themselves were being led? Such was the situation of the young novice and his companions in body and mind. But whatever they might have to fear for themselves, great as was their own sufferings, pity took possession of them on seeing the frightful misery of that sad troop of captives and the revolting brutality of their masters. Alas, they could do nothing to succor the afflicted, nothing to resist the others. All the country situated east of the Konza was only a forest for over an extent of 20 miles. The trees, however, whether they perish under the biting of the numerous insects of these countries, or whether troops of elephants beat them down while they are still young, are less crowded here than in the country next to the seacoast. The march, then, under the trees would not present obstacles. The shrubs might be more troublesome than the trees. There was, in fact, an abundance of those cotton trees, 7 to 8 feet high, the cotton of which serves to manufacture the black and white striped stuffs used in the interior of the province. In certain places, the soil transformed itself into thick jungles, in which the convoy disappeared. Of all the animals of the country, the elephants and giraffes alone were taller than those reeds which resemble bamboos, those herbs, the stalks of which measure an inch in diameter. The agents must know the country marvelously well, not to be lost in these jungles. Each day the caravan set out at daybreak, and only halted at midday for an hour. Some packs containing tapioca were then opened, and this food was parsimoniously distributed to the slaves. To this potatoes were added, or goat's meat and veal, when the soldiers had pillaged some village in passing. But the fatigue had been such, the repose so insufficient, so impossible even during these rainy nights, that, when the hour for the distribution of food arrived, the prisoners could hardly eat. So, 8 days after the departure from the Konza, 20 had fallen by the way, at the mercy of the beasts that prowled behind the convoy. Lions, panthers, and leopards waited for the victims which could not fail them, and each evening after sunset their roaring sounded at such a short distance that one might fear a direct attack. On hearing those roars, rendered more formidable by the darkness, Dick Sand thought with terror of the obstacles such encounters would present against Hercules's enterprise, of the perils that menaced each of his steps. And meanwhile, if he himself should find an opportunity to flee, he would not hesitate. Here are some notes taken by Dick Sand during this journey from the Konza to Kazond. 25 marches were employed to make this distance of 250 miles, the march in the trader's language being 10 miles, halting by day and night. Froth to 27th April. Saw a village surrounded by walls of reeds, 8 or 9 feet high, fields cultivated with maize, beans, sorghas, and various arachides. 2 blacks seized and made prisoners, 15 killed, population fled. The next day crossed an impetuous river, 150 yards wide. Floating bridge formed of trunks of trees, fastened with lions, piles half broken. Two women, tied to the same fork, precipitated into the water. One was carrying her little child. The waters are disturbed and become stained with blood. Crocodiles glide between the parts of the bridge. There is danger of stepping into their open mouths. Apeth crossed a forest of bauhineers, trees of straight timber, those which furnished the iron wood for the Portuguese. Heavy rain, earth wet, march extremely painful. Perceived toward the center of the convoy, poor Nan, carrying a little Negro child in her arms. She drags herself along with difficulty. The slave chained with her limps, and the blood flows from her shoulder, torn by lashes from the whip. In the evening, camped under an enormous baobab with white flowers and a light green foliage. During the night, roars of lions and leopards, shots fired by one of the natives at a panther. What has become of Hercules? Apathanthe, first colds of what they call the African winter, dew very abundant. End of the rainy season with the month of April. It commences with the month of November. Plains still largely inundated. East winds which check perspiration and renders one more liable to take the marsh fevers. No trace of Mrs. Weldon, nor of Mr. Benedict. Where would they take them, if not to Kazonde? They must have followed the road of the caravan and preceded us. I am eaten up with anxiety. Little Jack must be seized again with the fever in this unhealthy region. But does he still live? From May 1st to May 6th. Crossed, with several halting places, long plains, which evaporation has not been able to dry up. Water everywhere up to the waist. Myriads of leeches adhering to the skin. We must march for all that. On some elevations that emerge are lotus and papyrus. At the bottom, under the water, other plants with large cabbage leaves on which the feet slip, which occasions numerous falls. In these waters, considerable quantities of little fish of the silurus species. The natives catch them by billions in wickers and sell them to the caravans. Impossible to find a place to camp for the night. We see no limit to the inundated plain. We must march in the dark. Tomorrow many slaves will be missing from the convoy. What misery! When one falls, why get up again? A few moments more under these waters and all would be finished. The overseer's stick would not reach you in the darkness. Yes, but Mrs. Weldon and her son, I have not the right to abandon them. I shall resist to the end. It is my duty. Dreadful cries are heard in the night. 20 soldiers have torn some branches from resinous trees whose branches were above water. Livid lights in the darkness. This is the cause of the cries I heard. An attack of crocodiles. 12 or 15 of those monsters have thrown themselves in the darkness on the flank of the caravan. Women and children have been seized and carried away by the crocodiles to their pasture lands. So Livingstone calls those deep holes where this amphibious animal deposits its prey, after having drowned it, for it only eats it when it has reached a certain degree of decomposition. I have been rudely grazed by the scales of one of these crocodiles. An adult slave has been seized near me and torn from the fork that held him by the neck. The fork was broken. What a cry of despair! What a howl of grief! I hear it still. May 7th, Anth. The next day they count the victims. 20 slaves have disappeared. At daybreak I look for Tom and his companions. God be praised, they are living. Alas, ought I to praise God? Is one not happier to be done with all this misery? Tom is at the head of the convoy. At a moment when his son Bat made a turn, the fork was presented obliquely, and Tom was able to see me. I search in vain for old Nan. Is she in the central group, or has she perished during that frightful night? The next day, past the limit of the inundated plain, after 24 hours in the water, we halt on a hill. The sun dries us a little. We eat, but what miserable food? A little tapioca, a few handfuls of maize, nothing but the troubled water to drink. Prisoners extended on the ground, how many will not get up? No, it is not possible that Mrs. Weldon and her son have passed through so much misery. God would be so gracious to them as to have them led to Kazonde by another road. The unhappy mother could not resist. New case of smallpox in the caravan, the endau, as they say. The sick could not be able to go far. Will they abandon them? May 9th, they have begun the march again at sunrise. No laggards. The overseer's whip has quickly raised those overcome by fatigue or sickness. Those slaves have a value, they are money. The agents will not leave them behind while they have strength enough to march. I am surrounded by living skeletons. They have no longer voice enough to complain. I have seen old Nan at last. She is a sad sight. The child she was carrying is no longer in her arms. She is alone, too. That will be less painful for her, but the chain is still around her waist, and she has been obliged to throw the end over her shoulder. By hastening, I have been able to draw near her. One would say that she did not recognize me. Am I, then, changed to that extent? Nan, I said. The old servant looked at me a long time, and then she exclaimed, "You, Mr. Dick, I before long I shall be dead." "No, no, courage," I replied, while my eyes fell so as not to see what was only the unfortunate woman's bloodless spectre. "Dead," she continued, "and I shall not see my dear mistress again, nor my little Jack. My God, have pity on me." I wished to support old Nan, whose whole body trembled under her torn clothing. It would have been a mercy to see myself tied to her, and to carry my part of that chain, whose whole weight she bore since her companion's death. A strong arm pushes me back, and the unhappy Nan is thrown back into the crowd of slaves, lashed by the whips. I wish to throw myself on that brutal. The Arab chief appears, seizes my arm, and holds me till I find myself again in the caravan's last rank. Then, in his turn, he pronounces the name, Negoro. Negoro, it is then by the Portuguese's orders that he acts and treats me differently from my companions in misfortune. For what fate am I reserved? May 10th, today passed near 2 villages in flames. The stubble burns on all sides. Dead bodies are hung from the trees the fire has spared. Population fled.